At Holborn Assets, we know that trust is the foundation of any financial partnership. For over 25 years, we have been more than a financial services company. We have been a trusted partner to over 20,000 clients with 26 offices across 18 countries. Our dedication to our clients has earned us a 5-star rating on Trustpilot with over 2,000 glowing reviews. As a fully regulated, multi-award winning company, we are trusted with managing over $2 billion in assets. Our team of fully qualified advisors is committed to providing you with personalized, market-leading financial solutions. Choose Holborn Assets, your trusted partner in wealth management and financial advice. Visit our website or call us today to start your journey towards financial success.
Right, good. As I said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So before we get started with this webinar on tax residency, something that I would like to make very clear to everyone, that I myself, Matthew, I am not a registered tax practitioner inside South Africa. And therefore, I am not licensed to provide you with advice in terms of tax. If you would like advice with regards to your own circumstances and taxes, or would like help in terms of your current tax matters, please do contact your accountant or a licensed tax practitioner back home, or reach out to me and I will put you in touch with someone who is a licensed tax practitioner inside South Africa. This webinar is purely for educational purposes, based on the current interpretation by SARS and my understanding of the South African Income Tax Act and its interpretation notes. So let's get started. A bit about Holborn, who we are as a company. Holborn, we were founded just over a quarter century ago in the late 90s. We're currently the second largest independently owned independent financial advisory globally. We have assets under administration of just over $3 billion at the moment. And we are currently in 18 different countries across the globe, managing the wealth of 30,000 different clients. A bit of information then about me. I am a senior associate with Holborn, and I focus on investments and financial solutions within an international market. I'm a cross-border financial planning and investment tax specialist. And I have years of experience and knowledge, having lived both in the UK, South Africa, as well as in different parts of Asia. In terms of qualifications, I have a national diploma in financial management. I have 2 tertiary qualifications, specifically in tax and tax law. I have my RE5, which is the regulatory exam required to be able to give advice from South Africa. I also have passed my level 3 and level 4 chartered exams with the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investments in the UK. And I am a member of the South African Institute of Taxation. So let's get started. Now, why did I decide to do this webinar? Why am I doing this for the sake of tax residency for everyone living in Asia? I deal specifically with helping clients outside of South Africa set up their investments, their savings, their retirements in a way that is tax efficient. That is where my tax structuring comes in. And in doing so, I often have contact with a lot of people from around the globe where for some reason they send their money back home or they set up things abroad, but they also have money back home and they have tax issues. And something that came to light very recently in conversations with a few people was where I had one client in particular who mentioned that she had 150,000 rands worth of tax penalties and outstanding taxes because although she was living abroad, SARS had penalized her and charged her taxes. She wasn't quite sure why or how that had come about. Anyhow, she'd done her things every year like she's meant to. Her accountant was doing it for her. The problem is, though, that in this case, her accountant had said that she was unemployed, which obviously, question one, are you working? No one's asking where are you working, they're asking are you working? Yes, she was working. She was working in the US, so she was employed. However, on her tax return, she'd effectively lied and said she wasn't working. And then the other side of it is that SARS became aware of this because, well, like most South Africans, You take your money that is now exempt of tax and you go and you send it back to South Africa and you put into some other structure. She was putting hers into a tax-free savings account, and SARS asked, well, if you're unemployed, how are you saving 3,000 Rand a month and where is it coming from? So you need to be cognizant of what it is that you're doing. And if you're setting up your savings and investments, you need to do so in a manner that is not going to create tax implications for you or tax problems for you either now or, more importantly, later down the line. So that's just one of the examples. I then also spoke to someone else who'd had a 50,000 Rand fine from SARS. So, and this is becoming more and more prevalent. And after speaking to quite a few people and sharing this information, I got contacted by so many people who just had no idea whether they should be filling in a tax return or not. There were some even who were not needed to fill in tax returns, were not within the eyes or within the scope of SARS, who had, after moving abroad, deliberately gone and registered themselves with SARS, almost like shouting, hey, tax me, tax me, tax me, you know, please don't forget me. And then after that, not filed a single return. You are creating major headaches for yourself when it comes to doing that. So that led me to do this webinar on what exactly is tax residency, because tax residency has got nothing to do with where you live. Very briefly, I won't go into too much detail, but you get residency in terms of tax residency, you get domicile, and you get nationality. Your nationality is which passport do you hold? And you're going to have a South African passport and a British passport, or South African passport and a European passport, or you can have you can have different passports. But your nationality is which passport do you have? Your domicile is where you live. And you can be living in China, but you can still be tax resident in South Africa. You can be living in Korea, but still be tax resident inside South Africa. You could have been living in the UK for the last 30 years and still be tax resident inside South Africa. So tax residency has got nothing to do with where you live. It's got to do with where you are tax resident. Now, what we will look at when we go through this webinar is we will look at the exemption. And by the exemption here, we are referring to the exemption that everyone seems to know about, that Section 10, 1.25 million tax exemption that you qualify for if you are someone living and earning income abroad. Now, there are reasons and requirements to be able to claim that exemption. So we will look at what qualifies, what type of income qualifies for that exemption, who is excluded from that exemption. Then what does SARS actually say? What is SARS' interpretation of that? Not what my friend says or what Tom says or what my accountant says, who's used to dealing with South Africans inside South Africa, but doesn't really deal a lot with South Africans living outside South Africa. And then we'll also, how does SARS interpret this? Then we'll look at specifically, for the sake of clients where I have a large majority, I will look at the Korean and South African dual tax agreement, as well as the China and South Africa dual tax agreement. So let's get started. And to break it up, before I go into detail, I've put it into a question and answer sort of format. What I will do later is I will start a poll, and in that poll, you can answer those questions, and those questions, if you like, will help me or an accountant, someone who specializes with offshore, to be able to say, right, get back to you and say, okay, you are tax resident in South Africa, you need to do this and this and this, or no, you aren't, you are safe. So please do take part in that poll later. So first question first, what does the foreign employment income exemption mean? Very simply, Section 10.1.02 provides you with an exemption on foreign employment income that you receive for any services that you do outside of South Africa. So if you work outside of South Africa, it gives you an exemption, meaning you don't have to pay tax on that particular money, provided that certain requirements are met. Now, something that many people may be aware of, there is what we call the expat 2020 tax, and that's because the rules changed on the 1st of March 2020. Now, before March 2020, the requirements regarding the exemption, if they're all met, was basically just that you worked outside South Africa. But from the 1st of March 2020, those requirements changed, and a limit was put on that exemption, meaning as long as you're working and living outside South Africa, now instead of all your income being free of tax, only 1.25 million is free of tax. Again, if you meet all of those requirements. Any remuneration, so any income received that's above that, in other words, in excess of that 1.25 million, will be subject to normal tax inside South Africa, irrespective of whether you've paid tax in another country or not. And then obviously you can apply for relief on double taxation where certain laws allow that. Simply all that means is, as long as you meet the requirements, any income below 1.25 million that you earn abroad is free of tax inside South Africa. Anything above that, you will pay tax on. So we need to know then, where do you know whether you qualify or not for that exemption? So first of all, let's see what types of income. When SARS says income or remuneration, what do they mean? What do you need to declare in your tax return? So it's if you earn any kind of salary, any kind of wages, any kind of commissions, or if you charge any kinds of fees, any taxable benefits, so any meals that you get at schools or at the employment place, any accommodation, any transport, any flight tickets, any severance packages, anything that you get, including your leave time, including your overtime pay, any bonuses, gratuities, gifts, anything basically that is defined as income under the South African Tax Act is included in what can be exempted. So that's what it covers. All of those things you may apply for an exemption for. Now, what is excluded from that exemption? The following categories are excluded. Individuals where you are a public officer or you've been appointed or deemed to be appointed under an act of parliament. Employees who are employed in the national, provincial, and local sphere of government, certain constitutional institutions, national and public entities, municipal entities, independent contractors and individuals who are self-employed also do not qualify for that exemption. So if you are living and working abroad and you are not, and this is very important, if you are not an employee, but you are registered as an independent contractor, and I know this is very important because very often in South Korea, you will have teachers who are employed as independent contractors, not as employees. And there are reasons why companies do that. So if you're an independent contractor, you do not qualify for that exemption, meaning the first 1.25 million that you earn abroad is not exempt from tax in South Africa. For the rest of you, if you're an employee, the first 1.25 million is exempt. Now, all that means is that you're not going to pay tax in South Africa, but you have to apply for that exemption because remember, you're still South African tax resident. You need to fill in a tax form. Remember, your domicile may be in Asia, where you live. Your nationality may be South African or even a different nationality, but your tax residency is South African. And that doesn't matter how many years you've lived abroad. So to try and clarify this and clear this up, what I will do is we will look at what does SARS actually say. And to do this, I'm going to stop sharing my presentation for a second and let's move over to the SARS website. There we go. Hopefully now everyone can see the SARS website and we'll take it from there. So directly from the horse's mouth, as they would say. Foreign employment income exemption. Now, again, like I said, certain things changed. We have an interpretation note, which I will go through later. And this basically is the, as it says, the explanatory note. And then the changes with the update on employment income exemption from March 2020. And that was effectively just where before March, it was all income. After March 1st, 2020, it's only the first 1.25 million. So let's look at the residence-based tax system. And that's because in 2001, South Africa moved from what they call a source-based tax system to a residence one, meaning before 2001, you paid tax on where you earned your money. So if you earned money in the UK, you paid tax there. If you earned money in China, you paid tax there. If you earned money in South Africa, you paid tax in South Africa. But then it changed and became residence-based. So not where you're earning your money, but where you are tax resident. So not where you're living, but where you are tax resident. And this is where then it meant that residents would be taxed subject to their worldwide income. And non-residents, again, tax residents, would be subject to only income from within South Africa. So as a South African tax resident, you are based on your worldwide income. It doesn't matter where you are living or where you are earning that money, you are still taxed in South Africa on anything that you earn globally. So how do we know then if you are tax resident in terms of South Africa? So an individual is resident for tax purposes in South Africa, either by way of you're ordinarily a resident here, or by the way of the physical presence test. So there are two tests that SARS uses. Now, it is not one of those they use the one or the other. In actual fact, the first one is you are ordinarily resident, and then they will use the physical presence test. So the concept of ordinarily resident, although it's not clearly defined, and the determination of whether you are or not an individual of ordinary tax resident needs to be done by case. So SARS can look at this and decide in terms of its opinion whether you are or aren't based on their interpretation of the actual laws. And they set out a list of factors that need to be taken into account in determining whether, it doesn't matter whether you're living, whether you're a tax resident still or not. And this is what we will go through later on in the actual interpretation notes. Now, it's important to know that an individual can become tax resident by either way of physical presence. So if you come to South Africa for more than a certain amount of time, even if you're not South African, you can become tax resident inside South Africa. And this is where the physical presence test becomes important. An individual who is deemed to be exclusively resident in a different country, though, for the purposes of tax, because of a tax treaty. And this is where it's not as simple as these two tests, because there are also, and that's why I'll go through that later, double tax agreements or dual tax agreements in place. So you can, by virtue of a double tax agreement, be deemed as only taxable in one particular jurisdiction. So therefore, it allows or follows that an individual may qualify as resident under ordinarily resident inside South Africa, or even by that physical presence test. But that individual will not be regarded as a South African tax resident if that person is in another country or of another country when applying that particular tax treaty. Then, just to clear things up, what is the impact of financial immigration on tax residents? Because this is something that comes about so often. And I've had a few people on social media comment on, I applied for this and I did that and they cost me this huge amount of money, and only to be told, you know, it's not going to work. So let's read what SARS says. Acquiring approval from the South African Reserve Bank to emigrate from a financial perspective is not connected to your tax residence. This is the reason why the whole financial immigration, what would you call that, sort of scenario or system was abandoned and replaced just a few years ago. Why? Because so many companies were selling financial immigration and charging huge amounts of money for people to financially emigrate because they thought they were not going to be paying taxes inside South Africa anymore. Financial immigration has got nothing to do with taxation. Financial immigration is merely one factor that may be taken into account whether or not you've broken your tax residency or not. But having financially emigrated does not mean you're not tax resident inside South Africa. An individual's tax residence is not automatically broken when she or he financially emigrates. The financial immigration system was replaced by the new rules that say as long as you've been out of the country for 3 years, then you may apply to break tax residency. Again, there are certain factors and things that you need to contend with and that you need to be able to prove. But at least then you don't need to pay someone, thousands and thousands of rands to apply for tax, financial immigration for a system that doesn't really work anymore. So how do you break your tax residency? Financial immigration doesn't break tax residency. What is breaking tax residence? Now remember, just to recap everyone, or for those who've joined late, you get nationality, domicile, and tax residence. Nationality is what passport you have, and you can have any passport but still be a South African tax resident. Domicile is where you live. You can be living anywhere in the world. You could have been living there for 10, 20, 30 years, but that doesn't mean that you're still not South African tax residents. Tax residency is based on a different set of rules. So the determination of whether an individual breaks his or her tax residence is a factual inquiry. It's based on certain facts. And whether or not you cease to be ordinarily resident. So even though you may have been out of South Africa for 10 years, 20 years, or even 30 years, being outside of South Africa for 30 years, you clearly pass in terms of the physical presence test because you're not here and you've been abroad for 30 years. But that doesn't mean you will pass when it comes to the ordinarily residence test. So here, an individual who is resident by virtue of the physical presence test ceases to be resident as soon as that person is outside of South Africa for more than a full year or 330 days continuous. And you are deemed to have disposed of your assets, and there are certain capital gains tax events that take place. So when that individual breaks his or her tax residence. Now, individual is deemed to dispose of those things, again, worldwide. So even if you have assets outside, it still gets calculated, excluding obviously movable property inside South Africa. But we still have, that's the physical presence test, we still have the ordinarily residence test that we need to contend with. So what is the exemption? Now, if we look at section 10, before March 2020, under this section, the South African tax resident who is an employee, so in other words, again, not a contractor, but who is an employee and renders services outside of South Africa, who has been abroad for longer than 183 days and is continuously outside exceeding 60 days. So basically, if you've been abroad for more than half a year, then you are exempt from income. That exemption does not apply if you're not a South African resident. If all the requirements are met, then you would qualify for the exemption on your entire salary. And that obviously is what then changed. From 2020 March onwards, you are no longer, even though you are required to be again 183 days outside of South Africa, so basically half a year, in order to qualify for the exemption, only the first 1.25 million of that foreign income earned will qualify as the exemption with effect to the years obviously after 2020. And this is because you might have people who've been living abroad since 2016 or since 2010 and who've never filed any returns, and they still need to pay tax on all of that money up until 2020. And then need to claim exemption, obviously, again, for anything after 2020. What type of income is covered? That's what we covered in that question and answer part at the very beginning. Can you pay double tax? Yes, double taxation can occur. There are instances where that can actually happen, particularly if you're earning more than the 1.25 million. So for many, for example, teachers who are living abroad, for most of you, that won't be an issue. You'll be earning less than that 1.25 million. But again, you remember you need to claim that exemption. It's not automatically free of tax. And then there are certain reliefs from double tax, but we will go into in more detail. So if that's the first part, the next part that we will then look at is trying to understand in slightly more detail the actual interpretation by SARS. Now, how does SARS look at? And this comes from their interpretation note, the definition of who is ordinary resident, because there's been a lot of talk now about residents and ordinarily residents and physical presence tests, and it gets very confusing for many people. So let's boil it down to very simply, how does SARS determine whether you are South African tax resident? Are you ordinarily resident inside South Africa? So again, that background, the fact that SARS changed from being a source-based tax system to one that is residence-based. And as a result, certain acts within the law were needed to change. And certain exclusions, for example, and exemptions were made available for income tax on worldwide income derived within and outside of South Africa. So it's not just money you earn inside South Africa, it's money that you earn outside of South Africa. If you are non-resident, then obviously it's a different story. Money outside of South Africa is outside of South Africa. Money inside South Africa, though, earned inside, is taxed inside South Africa. The definition of what is income, so the Act, describes what that is, and then also who is an actual resident. Now, you can be ordinarily resident, or you can have the physical present test for a specific period. In other words, there are two tests applicable to determine whether or not you are resident of South Africa, a tax resident. The ordinarily residence test and the physical presence test. The physical presence test is dealt in a different interpretation note, and the implications of that in terms of tax avoidance and double taxation is also considered. So what does the law say? Although the law does not define ordinarily resident, the courts have interpreted to mean certain things, and the concept to mean the country to which you would naturally, as a matter of course, return to from his or her wanderings. So very simply, the way the court interprets this, where are you naturally or ordinarily resident? Where will you go back to when you've finished all your travels? Now, whether you're traveling for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whether you spend the next 30 years traveling from country to country, where, as a matter of course, will you naturally return to? And very simply, this is where some people try and claim I'm non-tax resident inside South Africa, but I'm on a 2-year or I'm on a 10-year visa. When that visa runs out, if you're not able to expand that visa or extend that visa, you're going to have to come back to South Africa. So the court is not going to rule that you are not resident if you have no choice but to come back. Even if you've got a 10-year visa and you're confident I'll get my visa renewed and my visa renewed and my visa renewed, the very simple fact is most visas are employment-based. And when you're too old to work, again, where are you going to have to return to? Unless you have another passport, a different nationality, and can say, I'm not returning to South Africa because I'm going to go and live in, Spain. The place that you're naturally going to return to if you've only got a South African passport is South Africa. And then also, you get those who say, I'm not resident inside South Africa, but I go home every year or every 3 years to visit my family. So you keep returning here. It is therefore, it might be called the person's usual or principal residence, and could also be described more aptly in comparison to other countries as your real home. So you're living and working abroad, but where is your real home? Your real home is in South Africa. And there are obviously different court cases that one can use in terms of that to provide backup. Now, in the Canadian case, Thompson versus the Minister of National Revenue, in this case, it was held that a person is ordinarily resident in the place, and you'll know that South African law doesn't only follow court cases inside South Africa. We follow normal Roman law or English law. So here, based on that court ruling, the term ordinary residence was settled in terms of where you're routinely, where your life is regularly, where you customarily live, which in mind and in facts settles into your ordinary mode of living, your accessories, social relations, interests, conveniences. And this is also where something that SARS looks at when they look at determining ordinary resident Yes, you may be living in China or Korea or Malaysia or Thailand or in the UK or somewhere else, but your retirement savings is inside South Africa, your family is inside South Africa, your investments are all inside South Africa, you have life insurance inside South Africa, but you're telling me you're not ever going to return to South Africa. The one thing just doesn't speak to the other. And SARS will look at that and on a balance of odds look at, well, where is your center of influence? Where is your routine? So if we look at that in terms of a summary, courts have held that when it comes to the concept of ordinary residence, it refers to living in a place with some degree of continuity, apart from going abroad, your temporary absences, you were born and raised in South Africa, and now you've been abroad for 3 years or 4 years or 6 years, but you've got a South African passport, you're only there on a temporary visa, all your savings, your investments, all your life insurance, your family, again, it's very difficult to argue that you are never coming back, you're permanently living abroad, but you have no permanent visa. So where your permanent place of abode is. Also, very often where your belongings are stored. So that gives us a sense of ordinarily resident and what are the things are that SARS will consider when it comes to looking at ordinary residents. So think of yourself, if you're saying, I've moved abroad, I'm going to cease tax residency in South Africa because I'm never going back to South Africa, then one needs to look at also what type of visa are you on, what passport are you on, where is your family, where is your life insurance, where is your retirements, your savings. And most South Africans, believe it or not, send their money straight back home, and then try to argue that, no, I'm not going back home. So the application of the law, the question whether you are ordinary resident in a country is one that is of fact. And it's a case that is decided on its own facts, having regard to the principles that are already established in law. SARS can look at it and they can, case by case, decide what they deem you to be when it comes to ordinary residence based on facts. And this is where it becomes very dangerous particularly within the world of social media, where you have someone saying, oh, I don't have to pay tax, I never did this, I never did that. But that may very well be because your particular sets of circumstances, your center of living, your nationality, and all sorts of other things may have very well been very different. So you can't just go and take a blanket statement and make that as tax advice for everyone. And this is also why, in terms of myself, I don't give tax advice. I'm not licensed inside South Africa, even inside South Africa, but I don't advise on tax in social media or on webinars, because the simple fact is each person's circumstances, although it may look similar on the outside, could be very, very different on the inside, and certainly very different from the perspective the way SARS would view it. A physical presence, and this is very important, a physical presence at all times is not a requisite to be ordinarily resident in the Republic. So you don't have to be inside South Africa at all times to be tax resident inside South Africa. The following two requirements need to be present: an intention to become ordinary resident in a country, and, so not or, and steps that are indicative of your intention that you are busy carrying out. So, you can't just have, I'm living abroad and I don't intend to come back to South Africa. SARS will look at, well, what steps are you taking? What are the other factors or mitigating factors that are in place? How can you prove that you never plan to come back to South Africa? You plan to live for the rest of your life are you marrying someone, or have you married someone in that particular nationality, and you're being able to get a different passport? Have you applied for, or are you applying for permanent residence in that particular country? What where are your savings? Where are your investments? Where's your retirement plans? I don't plan on retiring in South Africa, but I have a retirement annuity inside South Africa. Sort of, if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it probably is a duck. Your mode of life, as such. And it cannot be said that you have a real home sort of anywhere. So, and this is a common feature, particularly of multinationals and people who live across many different countries. So one needs to look at where would the courts, or where would SARS determine you to be ordinarily resident? And the onus, obviously, in other words, who needs to prove that? Well, that is on you. It is not on the government to be able to prove that, or for SARS to prove that. Some of the factors that they would look at, for example, would be, do you have a permanent or fixed place of residence? Do you have a home that is yours? Not one that you're renting from year to year, or rental contract, but one that you actually own. It's your permanent home. Your habitual abode, where you go back to every time after you finish traveling. Or do you go back to South Africa every few years, or do you never come back to South Africa? Where are your personal interests, your family, friends, everyone else? Your status, and this is very important, your status within that individual country. Are you just there as an immigrant on a work permit and certain conditions and things where you cannot become permanent resident there? So for example, if you're on an E2 visa, you cannot argue that you are not South African tax resident, because your visa has to be renewed every so often. Where are your personal belongings? Your nationality, and this is the one thing you can't get away from. What passport do you have? Do you have a Chinese passport that you're never coming back to South Africa and you're going to stay in China? Do you have a Korean passport that you're saying you're never coming back to South Africa and you're staying in Korea? Where's your family? Where are your parents, brothers, sisters, that sort of thing? School, church, everything else. And then there are certain other things that come across. Now, again, this is very important. SARS loves this sort of thing. The above list is not exhaustive or specific. It's merely just a guideline. Again, SARS has the discretion to be able to, on a case-by-case basis, decide what it requires and deems for you to be qualify in terms of, and what you need to prove in terms of being non-resident. So when it comes to this, you need to be examined as a whole. And the personal acts as well also need to, your personal acts, what it is you do, will also receive special attention. So hopefully that sort of, and then they go into examples in terms of that, but hopefully that gives you an idea that at the bottom line, unless you have a foreign passport and you can prove that you're never coming back to South Africa, in most instances, you will still be ordinarily resident inside South Africa. And if you're ordinarily tax resident inside South Africa, under certain conditions, you need to be submitting a tax return inside South Africa. And remember, being ordinarily tax resident in South Africa means you are taxed on your worldwide income, not just income that you earn inside South Africa. So you need to declare your worldwide income. You need to tell SARS, I've earned X amount of money in Malaysia, or I've earned X amount of money in China, or X amount of money in Korea, or X amount of money in Japan. Then you can claim an exemption. Right, let me go back to my presentation. Where's the share PowerPoint? Sorry, I usually don't like switching between things. I have everything on PowerPoint, but I wanted to get it, like I said earlier, straight from the horse's mouth, straight from SARS website and the interpretation note directly. Right, so now that we know that you are more than likely tax resident inside South Africa. You have those who were not within the scope or within the eyes of SARS. SARS didn't even know you existed until you stuck up your hand and said, please tax me, by claiming you want to be South African tax resident to claim a double an exemption inside Korea or China from having to pay taxes for the first 2 years. What you don't realize is that effectively you told SARS, yes, I don't want to pay taxes in Korea where it's 3%. I want to pay tax in South Africa where the lowest is 18%. I'm not quite sure why people would do that, but most South Africans that go abroad do that. So yes, so you have to declare your income abroad, and then you can claim an exemption. Now there are different ways of claiming exemption. Either you claim the exemption under Section 10, meaning anything then that's under that 1.25 million is free of tax inside South Africa. Yes, you still get taxed abroad, but you don't pay tax on inside South Africa. Anything above that is taxed at 40%. The other exemption that you can claim, if you don't want to go through all the effort of doing that exemption, is you can apply for an exemption under a tax treaty, under a double tax agreement or dual tax agreement. Here on the screen, I have the Korea and South Africa. Like I said, I'm going to go through Korea and China because that's where I get the most amount of people where they're confused. I'm going to go through those two agreements, and you'll find that they are very much similar in nature. Now, this is the convention between the Republic of South Africa and the Republic of Korea for the avoidance of double taxation and the prevention of fiscal evasion when it comes to taxes. Now, the key word here when it comes to these agreements is that you are not taxed twice. It's double tax. Okay, so the avoidance of double tax. You have to pay tax somewhere. So effectively, if you've moved to Korea, you've put up your hand and said, SARS, please tax me. And then you go to Korea and say, look, Korea, South Africa is going to tax me. And then you don't pay tax in Korea and you don't pay tax in South Africa. You're going to end up in trouble. Yet that's what most people do. They just don't know any different. Now, so let's go through this. So where by reason of this provision, an individual, meaning a person, is resident in both different countries. How do we then determine who gets to actually tax that person? So if you're South African tax resident, but you're living inside South Korea and you've got an ARC card and you're liable for tax there as well, so you're taxable in both countries, to avoid you being taxed in both, which country has the right to tax you first? So you shall be deemed to be a resident in the state in which you have a permanent home, if you have a permanent home available to you. You shall be deemed a resident of the state in which you have closer economic ties, center of vital interest. So A, I've moved abroad, and no, I don't have a permanent home, but I do have, I don't have my savings and my investments and my retirements back home. I don't have, all these other things, business interests and things. It's just me on my own in living in a foreign country. Then under A, you shall be deemed to be resident of the state where you have that where's your job, your income, that sort of thing. And that would then be abroad if you have nothing back home. However, if it's a little more complicated and, for example, yes, you do have savings and all sorts of other things and you have family and other economic ties and things back home, well, then let's see what is the other reason. Well, then here, if the state in which he or she, so your center of vital interest your vital interest cannot be determined. So if SARS cannot determine with great amount of accuracy or with certainty that your interests are 100% abroad or your interests are here, and you don't have a permanent home, remember, you're only there on an annual rental contract or something, or the accommodation belongs to the employer or something, then how do we determine where's your place of tax residence? So then they will look at where you have your habitual abode. Where do you naturally return to? And if they can't determine where you naturally return to, then, well, we see that other thing pop up, your passport. If a natural abode is in both states, because you visit both South Africa and you visit the foreign country regularly, you shall be deemed to be a resident where you are a national. So if you've got a South African passport, SARS will say, I'm sorry, you're a South African tax resident. And if you're a national of both, let's say you're lucky enough to have two passports, then SARS and the Chinese government, or SARS and Korean tax services National Tax Service will then argue it out as to who gets to tax you. So therefore, it becomes very complicated. Now, Most people, if you're young and you don't have all sorts of savings and investments back home, and you don't have retirement annuities, and you don't have a property that you own back home, and you don't have this that you do and that you do, and all it is just you on your own in a foreign country, then you should be able to, under the double tax agreement, claim that your income is taxable only in that particular country, because that's where your center of economics lies. And you would have to prove that then to SARS. Just very quickly, for again, with specific regards to that double tax agreement, any income, by the way, that is derived by an individual, so by yourself, who is a resident in a contracting state, so in a particular country, for professional services, again, of other services or other activities of a type of contractor scale, shall be taxable only in that state, if that's your regular base. And again, if you don't have a fixed base, then it becomes more of a problem in terms of figuring out where that is. That, though, is more for if you are not a employee, but if you are a independent contractor, or if you have a business. But I'm not going to go into business tax for now. More importantly, when it comes to Korean double tax agreement, is what if you are in the education system? If you are a professor or a researcher, so if you are visiting that state at the invitation of a university or a college or a school or any similar institution, and it's recognized by the government of that state, purely for the purposes of teaching. So you're there to teach and to carry out research at that institute. Then, in terms of the double tax agreement, you shall be exempt from tax in the first state. So you shall be exempt from tax in Korea, for example. That's why you get that 2-year exemption for a period not exceeding 2 years after your first arrival in that country. So you are claiming that you do not want to pay tax in Korea because you are paying tax back home. If we look at the Chinese double tax agreement, it is very, very similar. And hopefully by now people are understanding to realize what people refer to when it comes to resident. Again, for the purpose of this particular agreement between the government of the Republic of South Africa and the government of the People's Republic of China, again, for the avoidance of double taxation, not avoidance of taxation, but of double taxation. You don't get taxed in both countries. And again, for the prevention of fiscal evasion. Again, you are determined as being a resident in that contracting state. Means that if you're in China, it's any person under the laws of China that's liable to pay tax by reason of where you live, where your place is, your offices are, anything like that. In South Africa, though, it's not. In South Africa, it's any individual who is ordinarily resident inside South Africa, not physical presence on the earth. It's anyone who is ordinarily resident inside South Africa. So if we look at that further down, where by that reason you could be taxable in both, so you are ordinarily resident inside South Africa, but you also, because you live in China, that's where your domicile is. Remember the difference between domicile and resident. You are now suddenly taxable in both countries. So how do we avoid you having to pay tax in both? You shall be deemed to be a resident only in the state where you have a permanent home, not a rented home that's there, on a year-by-year contract, or accommodations provided by an employer or a school or something. Where is your permanent home? If you don't have a permanent home, then again, you shall be deemed by only in the state where your personal and economic relations are closer, your center of vital interest. Where is all your financial activity? Is your centers of influence, your family, your savings, your retirement, your life insurance, all of those things, are they all in China, or are they mostly back home inside South Africa? Because doing one thing and saying the other thing, you may very well be creating a situation where you can end up being taxed back home instead, because you just didn't follow, get the right advice. B, then if the state in which you have that financial interest or vital interest at least cannot be determined, then they will go back to look in that habitual abode. Where do you return to? And if you keep going back to South Africa for holidays, where is your home? Can you honestly argue that China is my home, even though I go back to South Africa every now and then? And then also, if that cannot be determined, if they can't prove it with that, then they can prove it with saying, well, you're still a South African national, so you have to come back to South Africa. And unless, of course, you're a national of both countries, so you've got both Chinese and South African passport, then it's up to the tax authorities to figure that out. China too, which most people do not know, has an Article 20, which is specifically when it comes to the remuneration, so income of teachers and researchers, similar to South Korea, where if you are invited by the state, and it's specifically the primary purpose is for giving lectures, conducting research at a college, school, or educational institution or scientific research institution recognized by the government for the purpose of that teaching or giving lectures, or doing research, then you shall only be taxed in China, not in both countries. Again, for the period of 2 years. So you can, again, you have to pay tax in one country or the other. You can't pay tax nowhere. So how do we summarize this and try and make this a little bit easier to understand? So let's say you are someone, you live in China or you live in Korea. That's the scenario. The outcome is you are more than likely, because of the double tax agreement, tax resident in China or Korea. But you are still ordinarily resident inside South Africa. So you do still need to submit a tax return inside South Africa and claim then an exemption, so that SARS knows that, yes, I've earned money. I've not been unemployed. I am employed. I'm just not employed inside South Africa. And the money that I earn is exempt, either under Section 10, because it's less than that 1.25 million. So thank you, SARS. I am earning money, but I don't have to pay tax on it. Or under the double tax agreement, meaning, thank you, SARS, I'm earning money, but again, it's exempt from taxes. Or if you, and that's obviously if you're living in China, Korea, but you also earn rental income inside South Africa, or you're also earning online money from online teaching or something, that money is taxable inside South Africa. Income that you've earned abroad will be most of the time more likely taxed abroad. You still need to declare it though inside South Africa and claim an exemption inside South Africa. If you have been abroad for less than 183 days, meaning, let's say, for example, you got the fall intake and you only moved abroad at the end of August or in September sometime to start work, then you've been in South Africa for more than 6 months. March, April, May, June, July, August. That means that you've been abroad for less than 163 days. Meaning then that you're going to end up being taxed inside South Africa on that money. It will be deemed as taxable inside South Africa. If you've earned income abroad, then it's taxed where you are resident according to the double tax agreement. So you claim an exemption based on that double tax agreement. But you still, again, you need to declare that income and claim that exemption. Any income earned in South Africa is taxed inside South Africa. So although you're living abroad, income abroad, taxed abroad, claim exemption in South Africa, income earned in South Africa, taxed inside South Africa. Any interest, any dividends, any capital growth, any rental income, any fees or any kind of gratuities or anything from online teaching or running a little export-import business, any other income that's inside South Africa is taxed inside South Africa. And again, very important, income includes interest, rent received, dividends, gifts, bonuses. Just because it's not, doesn't say the word salary, doesn't mean that it's not income or remuneration. Let me start that poll and then I will quickly finish. How do I find my poll now? Let me, more. Right, I'm going to launch a poll. Please do take part in that poll. I see it is launched. Great. Many people have taken part in that already. So again, very quickly, in terms of tax advice, I am not licensed to give tax advice inside South Africa. So if you are looking for advice, again, reach out, and I will put you in contact with someone who is licensed inside South Africa and can help with tax returns and can help with getting all your tax affairs in order and helping you to claim any exemptions that are due or deal with any penalties that you have. My expertise is not in the filing of tax returns and doing tax returns. My expertise is in the structuring of that wealth. Those making sure that your savings and investments, your retirement, all that sort of thing is set up in such a way that it doesn't create tax issues for you further down the line, somewhere where it can grow free of tax abroad in dollars, pounds, euros, somewhere where you can say, look, I'm not coming back. My retirement is abroad. My savings is abroad. My center, my vital centers of influence and living is all abroad. Then, and this is why for people who plan on staying abroad indefinitely, or people who don't plan on coming back to South Africa, people who don't see themselves coming back anytime soon, it makes sense to, if you're going to try and claim tax exemption inside South Africa, make sure that your life actually speaks to the same. I'm saying this, but it's so easy for SARS to prove that everything else is wrong. I see most people have done the polls. I am not going to, if I can ask the rest of you to please take part in that. I will be able to, for those of you who would like someone to reach out, I will be able to, based on some of the questions that you've answered, give you some sort of indication as to whether you should be submitting a tax return in South Africa or not. And if you want help with the tax, I can get someone, again, not me, I will get someone to help you with that. I am not doing a questions and answers, it's unusual. I'm not going to do a question and answer in terms of this particular webinar. And the reason for that is because tax is very, very specific to your own, as we've seen from the very complicated legal wording within this when it comes to determining tax residency. There's a lot involved, and you can have two people who look the same on paper, have similar situations, but can have two very different results when you go and you look at the actual underlying in-depth information. Again, you can have two people living abroad. One has a retirement plan back home, and the other one has nothing back home, and they're on different passports or they're on different visas. There's a lot again that plays a role when it comes to doing that. So I won't be doing a questions and answers session with this particular webinar. Please, as always, though, you are welcome to reach out. Let me share my, there we go. You are welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions, though. And that way, I am not advising you as someone inside South Africa. If you are living abroad, I'll be able to advise you as someone living abroad. You can reach out to me over WeChat, Matthew Taron. Kakao Talk, also Matthew Taron. You can also contact me via WhatsApp or on email, matthew.taron@holbornassets.com. Or you can reach out to me on Facebook Messenger. And I'm also the group expert on many of the South African expats abroad groups, as well as the income tax basics for South Africans abroad. So please reach out to me. I am more than willing to help and give advice where I can. Why do I do that? Well, very simply, inside South Africa, I deal with a very different type of client. And this affords me the time, freedom, expertise, and finances to be able to dedicate a portion of my time towards helping expats abroad. And why do I help South African expats abroad? Because I know from my own time living abroad that, and I'll give you an example in just a second, from my own time abroad, that most people have no idea what to do when they are living abroad, particularly when it comes to savings and investments and setting up their finances. Most will reach out to a local South African financial advisor or banker, and you'll end up in the same situation as I just spoke to a client this morning about, where here's a tax efficient solution. Let's give you an endowment. Now, like I told the person this morning, this one was living in Korea. Your effective tax rate in Korea is roughly 3%. Your endowment fixed, not floating or anything. Your fixed tax rate on an endowment is 30%. 10 times more than what you're paying in Korea. Now, bear in mind, if you're filling in your returns and you know that your income in South Africa is exempt, it means then that from a South African perspective, your actual tax rate is 0. So why on earth would you give someone a product where they're going to be paying tax at a fixed rate of 30%? That makes absolutely no sense. And I went through the details. I even showed him on the different websites from Alexander Graham, Discovery, and Sunlum, and all these places where they show you very clearly that it's fixed at 30%. So he asked, well, why would this advisor then tell me that? And I said, very often because they don't deal with expats. They don't deal with South Africans living abroad who are not, in terms of their income, who are not by double tax agreement resident inside South Africa, but are just ordinarily resident and can claim exemption and bring that tax rate down to 0. So for them, they think you're earning a huge amount of money and you're in the top tax bracket. You're not, because you're able to claim certain exemptions. So don't take your money, which is tax free. Obviously, you need to declare that, and go and make it taxable at a tax rate 10 times more than it should be. It makes no sense. But again, not all financial advisors or private bankers have a lot of experience or any experience dealing with tax and dealing with expats, and particularly cross-border financial planning. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I see most people have completed that webinar, or have completed the poll. So I am now going to end that poll, and I look forward to speaking to many of you. Those who have any questions, please do reach out. Thank you, and have a good evening on your side.